If you've seen my video about why NES colors are never consistent, then you know it doesn't work the way digital color conventionally works today. Essentially, the NES's graphics system is built entirely around composite video. Even the colors developers chose were basically just values in NTSC. So how then is it possible for an RGB mod to exist, let alone work really well? To know how modders were able to do it, we first have to take a look at this. It's the Nintendo PlayChoice 10 from 1986, and it's basically an NES packed into an arcade cabinet. The games are virtually identical, and you can even switch between them with a menu. Wow, it's like Nintendo invented the first EverDrive. But if you look closely at the screen, doesn't that look remarkably sharp? No dot crawl or fuzziness that we've come to expect from our home NESs, instead it's all sharp lines and distinct pixels. Well, that's no accident. While the hardware in these was like 95% NES, the graphics chip, known as the PPU, is a slight variant which produced RGB instead of composite. They use this chip in a few other devices too, most notably the Sharp C1 TV, which likewise is basically a TV with an NES built in. This does mean Nintendo had to choose a palette to map the NTSC values to, and like all palettes, there's a lot of debate as to whether it's any good or not. Nonetheless, RGB is RGB, and sometime in the late 90s, people realized that with a few minor modifications, the PPU from a PlayChoice 10 could be transplanted into an NES. Wired up to a Nintendo multi-AV port, it could make for a remarkably clean and seamless experience, though you would lose composite and RF output in the process. But the biggest problem with this approach is that there aren't a lot of these chips out there. To get one, you need to acquire a PlayChoice 10 board, a VS Duck Hunt board, or Sharp C1 and sacrifice it for the privilege. And considering any one of those could cost you between $1,000 and $5,000, that is one expensive chip. If getting RGB out of an NES was going to be even slightly viable for the average hacker, it wasn't going to be by harvesting PlayChoice 10s. There had to be another way. Well, what about cloning? Could we mass produce RGB PPUs ourselves? Well, it is true that there have been several unofficial clones of the NES's CPU and PPU ever since, well hell, since the NES was still contemporary. These were largely used in devices sold in countries that Nintendo didn't have a foothold or, more importantly, a patent in yet. And you can still get these chips today for as little as $1 from AliExpress. However, all of these cheap clones are, well, cheap, and they're known to exhibit all sorts of inaccuracies that you don't get on original hardware. Even if you could get a cheap RGB PPU clone, what's the point of playing on original hardware if you're going to introduce a bunch of emulation inaccuracies anyway? At this point, it seemed like getting RGB out of a stock PPU was nothing more than fantasy. That is, until late 2012 when NES dev forum member The Fox found a way. Let's take another look at the PlayChoice 10's PPU and a standard NES PPU side by side. I know, it's like trying to play a game of Spot the Difference, so let me highlight them here. On the PlayChoice 10 one, you can see there are dedicated pins for RGB output, but on the standard PPU, there are instead 4 pins labeled EXT0 to EXT3. What are these for? Well, it turns out these pins are part of a PPU feature that never ended up getting used. It was theoretically possible to wire up 2 PPUs together for double the graphics. The idea was one PPU set to output mode could generate an image and output it pixel by pixel through its EXT pins. Then a second PPU set to input mode could receive the image through its EXT pins and draw additional graphics on top of it. In theory, this combination could have produced graphics with more complexity than a single PPU on its own. However, we don't really have any examples because Nintendo never shipped any hardware with this configuration. But if you think about it, these pins effectively provide a clean digital video output from the NES's PPU. There's just one snag. This data still isn't in RGB or anything we could immediately use. The data is in 4-bit palette indexes. This makes sense. I mean, if you were using these pins for their intended purpose, the other PPU would be working with palettes too. So yes, we do get data pixel by pixel, but we still don't have enough to complete the image. Somehow we need to figure out what palette the PPU is using at any given time. What the Fox did was he basically put an FPGA between the NES CPU and PPU, mostly passing the data along but listening for whenever the game sets a palette entry. This means at all times it has its own copy of the palette, and more importantly can now make sense of the values coming out of the PPU's EXT pins. Well, almost. There's one more snag that I haven't mentioned yet. The NES actually has 2 palettes, one for the background data and one for the sprite data. Both of these palettes have 16 entries, which each fit perfectly into 4 bits, or in this case, the 4 EXT pins. But there's one bit of information that's missing. How do you know whether a pixel is using the background palette or the sprite palette? Well, the short answer is, you don't. This was an intentional limitation of the dual PPU paradigm. The receiving PPU would put the whole image into its background layer, so it could only have one palette anyway. There was no need to know what palette the sender was using. But obviously for our very unintended use case, it's a bit of a roadblock. So how did the Fox manage to get around this? Well, he ended up finding a trick that was equal parts hacky and brilliant. To recap, the final image is composed of palette indexes output by the PPU that the FPGA then matches to colors it received from the CPU. So while you might think we just pass the same palette entries along to the PPU, we don't actually have to, because all we're taking from the PPU are the palette indexes. We don't care about the PPU's composite output because the FPGA is the one producing the final image. So we can send the PPU completely different colors, like all black for the background and all white for the sprites. As long as the palette indexes remain the same, we can match them up to the right colors later on. The result is the PPU ends up making an image that looks like this. Sure, you wouldn't actually want to play it like this, but what we've made here is pretty much a perfect map of what pixels are part of the background and what pixels are part of the sprites. We've effectively encoded that final bit of information into the PPU's composite video output, and all the FPGA has to do is look at that to know exactly what palette to use on each pixel. This crazy trick actually works really well. With this, we have everything we need to reconstruct a pristine digital image, which we can then output to whatever we want. The Fox's prototype actually used VGA, and he did originally plan to turn it into some kind of mass-produced product, but sadly he never ended up getting the time to realize it. Ultimately, it didn't take long for another NES Dev Forum member, namely VileTim, who in real life goes by Tim Worthington, to figure out what the Fox had done. 9 months later, the NESRGB was a product, taking all of the same principles and outputting S-Video, RGB, and component. Today it has a few more comfort features like a new audio circuit with significantly lower noise than the one in the NES, and regular composite output for consoles like the Famicom and Top Loader, which usually only output RF. Once again, moving the NES into RGB means deciding on a palette, and the NES RGB leaves it up to the user. The most recent version has 6 to choose from, and allows you to wire up a switch or wire up the controller buttons to cycle through them. This makes it easy to select whatever palette you like most for each game, or hell, even different sections of each game. You can also switch the mod on and off if, for whatever reason, you need the regular composite and RF feedback. So this mod isn't just cheaper than the old PlayChoice 10 mod, it's also a little better too. Not only do you not have to butcher old hardware, you also don't have to put up with its controversial palette or lose any of the NES's original outputs in the process. So why don't we install it and give it a try? There are plenty of installation guides out there on YouTube, so I won't bore you with the details. I'll just summarize that if you want to check this mod out for yourself, you'll want to be fairly experienced with soldering since there are a few pretty major challenges you'll have to deal with. First is desoldering the original PPU from the board. This is necessary to put anything between the PPU and the CPU, but desoldering can be tough, and I wouldn't recommend it for beginners or anyone without the proper tools. I have a desoldering pump that makes short work of the PPU's 40 pins, but it's a little expensive if you don't do stuff like this regularly. Another is that the NES motherboard has 2 capacitors that will be in the way of the NES RGB. You have to heat up the legs and bend them down flat so the new board can sit in place. Finally, even once the board is installed and you have all the outputs you want wired up, you still have to figure out where you want the new plugs to come out. There are no free gaps on the NES case anywhere, so generally you're going to have to drill or cut your own. This does allow for some creativity. I've already mentioned a lot of people wire up to a Nintendo multi-AV port, the same port used on the SNES, N64, and GameCube. Out of the box, the kit comes with these plugs, with the idea that you'll drill through the case to mount them. There's nothing wrong with this, but what if you don't want to make any additional holes? Well, in theory, you can replace the NES's built-in ports, if you don't mind sacrificing lowly RF, but since all of the ports are part of the same power/RF module, to replace one, you kind of have to replace the whole thing. Still, this clean approach really appealed to me, so I figured if we have to replace the whole module, we may as well go all out. Why not replace it with a board that not only gives us S-Video and component, but also lets us run the whole NES off USB-C? Installing this was a whole project in and of itself, so if you want to see more of that, check out this members-only bonus video by clicking the link up here or in the description. Anyway, once you've figured all that out, the resulting picture looks amazing. Once again, I'm using the component output here, which quality-wise is practically equivalent to RGB, and I mean, you can tell, this is hands down the best quality I've ever seen come out of an NES. I don't wear glasses, but I imagine this is what it feels like putting them on. If you hook this up to a monitor, it doesn't even look like real hardware, it just looks like an emulator running in full screen. the most accurate emulator in the world. But as amazing as this is, at the end of the day, a hack is a hack, and there was no way we were going to get away with it with zero consequences. There are a handful of minor, but known issues with the NESRGB that you might want to consider before going all in with installing it. While many of them have been fixed by newer firmware updates, some are simply inherent to the way the mod works. Watching the composite video for palette changes requires precise timing, and in rare circumstances, this timing can desync, causing the color to shift by 1 pixel left or right. This is not common, I've certainly never seen it on my NES, but it has been known to happen and may require additional timing circuitry to fix. Additionally, some games use undocumented PPU functionality that manages to trip up the NES RGB. For example, this smooth gradient in Micro Machines exploits a palette quirk called Backdrop Override, which the NES RGB does not re-implement. As such, with the mod installed, it becomes a boring flat color instead. Here's another infamous example. An obscure RPG known as Arkista's Ring tries to read from the PPU in a way it isn't supposed to. With the PPU on its own, this value is always 0, but since the NES RGB modifies the data going to the PPU, the value becomes 1. The game doesn't expect this and ends up soft-locking after a handful of levels. It's kind of crazy how, even when using so much of the original hardware, these little edge cases can still sneak in. It's these sorts of games that are the bane of all emulator developers, and if these kinds of things concern you, you may not want to pull the trigger on an NES RGB. That being said, rest assured that these issues are quite rare, and for the games that most people are most likely to play, the mod does exactly what you want. And who knows, maybe in future revisions these issues could be solved too. Now, I'm sure for a lot of you the composite artifacts are part of the nostalgia, and I do get it. I mean, I'm still playing on a CRT for God's sake. But there is something I really like about seeing the image so crisp while still retaining a little old school charm. Today, an NES RGB kit sells for about $100 US, plus another 20 if you want the component output. Definitely not cheap, but pretty normal for something based around an FPGA. That being said, there is a cheaper clone from China called the Lava RGB, which you can get for about half that on AliExpress. I haven't tried it myself, but it looks like a worthy contender. While early versions lacked certain features like switching palettes and only supported NTSC consoles, the newer 2.0 version seems to no longer have those limitations. However, as you might expect from a Chinese clone of anything, there have been concerns raised about the quality of its hardware, so keep that in mind. Speaking of alternatives, there is also the high-def NES HDMI board, which does exactly the same thing but outputs HDMI instead of analog. Like I said, once you've got a digital image, you can pretty much do whatever you want with it. This is obviously the most convenient option for playing on a modern TV or monitor, and it has an incredibly comprehensive set of features to help you modernize your NES. Everything from smoothing modes, to scan lines, to switching resolutions, aspect ratios, and even overclocking the CPU. There's a lot here, and as such, this mod costs more than double what the NES RGB does. When you could get them. Yeah, supposedly this mod relies on parts that are no longer being produced, and while there are plans to redesign it around parts that are, this hasn't happened yet and there's no current estimate for when it will. Honestly, while I definitely see the appeal and hope they come back into production soon, I'm a bit too much of a purist for it. Not enough of a purist to put up with only composite and RF, but enough to feel the NES is best played on a CRT. Both of these options have been around for a long time and by this point are tried and true, but in the last few years there have been newer approaches that aim to fix their shortcomings. Mods like the RGB Blaster and PPU Digitizer use a different approach altogether. These newer mods don't sit between the CPU and PPU anymore. Instead, they closely monitor its address and data lines with precise timing to determine exactly what it's doing on each pixel, from which it too can effectively reconstruct the image. This makes it significantly easier to install since you no longer have to desolder the original PPU. In fact, in the case of the RGB Blaster, it can do it all with the signals exposed on the cartridge slot. This does make it virtually impossible to use on the front-loading NES since the video output now comes out of the cartridge, but that doesn't mean people haven't tried. And since they don't have to modify the data going to the PPU, they theoretically have an edge in accuracy too. At least games like Arkista's Ring won't have a problem anymore. In practice, there are still games that seem to trip them up for whatever reason. But hey, these are both still relatively new, so maybe these will get fixed in a future firmware release. And those aren't the only ones rethinking how to get RGB out of the NES. With the advent of modern FPGAs and reverse engineering techniques, there are complete PPU replacements that are huge improvements over those cheap clones from the 80s and 90s. The RGB 2CO2N from NX Labs is a complete PPU replacement with RGB outputs, whose party trick is that it can double the sprite limit, reducing or even eliminating the infamous flickering on many NES games. Unfortunately, there are quite a few NES RGB features it doesn't have. For example, it only outputs RGB, though I think it might have a VGA mode too, but no S-video, no component, or any of the original composite or RF outputs, which might be a little inconvenient depending on what screens are available to you. And it has at least one known bug that breaks a small number of games. It's also only available in Japan, meaning unless you happen to live there already, you'll need a friend or service to forward it to you. Still, some people swear by it, calling it the gold standard of RGB mods. But even more recently, another RGB PPU clone has appeared on the scene. The PPU Lite from RGK is a no-frills re-implementation that's completely open source and claims to be highly accurate while using the cheapest possible parts. It's actually based on the NES RGB design, to the point that with some minor rewiring and reflashing, you can actually build one out of an off-the-shelf lava RGB. It's kinda ironic that the FPGA we're using to merely read from the PPU is actually powerful enough to do its entire job. And yes, this too provides a wide selection of outputs and palettes to choose from. This is still very new and hasn't been widely tested yet, but if it's as accurate as it claims, it could indeed become one of the best ways to get RGB out of your NES. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a video where I check some of these new PPU clones out. Even though the original hardware has literally no support for anything more than composite and RF, thanks to some extremely clever community tricks, we have a ton of options for getting more out of this 40-year-old system. Honestly, I love seeing this kind of ingenuity from the community, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about it too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys. Don't forget, if you want to see me get my NES running off USB-C and outputting component NES video without having to drill any additional holes, check out this members-only bonus video by clicking the link on screen or in the description. Special thanks to all my patrons and members scrolling on the screen right now for making videos like this possible. And as always, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.